Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation and for your kind introduction. When Margit asked me to talk about the perspective on the status quo of private and public collections with regard to the acquisition and preservation of electronic or digital works, I was a bit unsure. Most of you probably know better than me what's going on. But when I was wondering what to tell you in my presentation, it came to my mind that the change in my work during the last years pretty much shows what has changed in public and private collections when it comes to time-based media. And on the other hand, it also shows the directions in which it could evolve. So I will try to give you a short and very subjective overview what were the most pressing questions or problems I came across in the last years and how they changed in the course of time. This will automatically lead, hopefully, to the conclusion what needs to be done to give time-based media artworks a similar presence in collections and a similar life expectancy as works of traditional art. When I started my business, I first searched for a name for my website. After some thinking, I just named it as Restaurmedia, which is simply composed of the German words restaurieren und media, also restoration and media. That pretty much described what I thought would be my main task as a freelance conservator, restoring old data carriers and obsolete media. That's why I was hunting for tape machines. As we heard today, it's still a common practice for setting up a lab. First thing is hunting for tape machines and, more important, cleaning machines. I bought one for U-Medic, which you can see here, one for VHS, one for Betacam tapes, and our well-known colleague, Friedrich Sams, built one custom-made cleaning machine for half-inch open-reel tapes for me. I even found one machine which was originally designed to clean computer tapes. These heavy and expensive machines then populated my lab. To be honest, the most of these machines had a very easy job. My clients were not lining up for tape cleaning. Yes, there was constant demand, and I closely worked with professional digitization studios and cleaned and frequently baked tapes. But most of my clients asked for other things. What tapes or media do we have? What conditions are they in? What's about storage? How to digitize? What targets formats shall we choose for digitization? Can you write the condition reports for video artworks in the exhibition? How can we ensure that our collection will survive in the future? What about obsolescence of media, display equipment, and file formats? What to do with acquisitions? It became obvious very quickly that there was a great need to answer these open questions. Well, maybe just a few words to my clients. Most of them are private or public collections and archives. In the beginning, I worked mainly for archives, but this has changed in the last years, and this is why. Archives are mostly dealing with content on media which needs to be digitized, while private and public collections dealing with artworks that are by accidental purpose located on media. Archives and art collections have different needs. Archives prioritize on the content. They want to get the content saved. The carriers are somewhat important, but the content is king. After the digitization, the carriers will be kept, but they somewhat lose their importance. That's why most of the bigger archives are already finished with digitization or near the end of their digitization plan. In contrast, art collections have a very strong interest in saving the whole artwork, so a more holistic approach is needed. Maybe that's why museums and collections are a little behind when it comes to digitization projects. For the assessment or evaluation of art collections or archives, I was traveling with my equipment to numerous places, always checking what type of tapes they have in the archive and, more important, checking the condition of the tapes. Since the content is most important, this information is crucial for all following steps. After the check of the tapes, the tender for digitization is tailored to the condition of the tapes. When I'm traveling now, most of my equipment fits into a small rugged container and consists of different computers, cables, and technical equipment. It is still about assessment and evaluation, but the media has changed completely. I use write blockers much more often than tape cleaners or videotex when I check artworks these days. Except for film, analog media is really an exception when acquisitions are made today. Analog media truly seems to be obsolete when it comes to new acquisitions in collections. One could think this would make it easier in handling and storage since digital technologies are everywhere today. When I visited archives or museums in the analog days, it was always a question about the correct storage. How does it look like? Is it adequate? Or does it need some improvements? I think a lot has improved in the past years, and that's not how it looks like everywhere. But it is still sometimes a challenging process to dive into the far corners of an archive. At the beginning, most of the questions concentrated on climate conditions and packing of the media. You will find a lot of advice in the literature about perfect conditions, so I won't talk about perfect solutions. My advice always was to spend the money for digitization and the digital storage instead for new housings or air conditioning. But besides that, there might be solutions which are very close to perfect when it comes to storage spaces for media. In 2007, I was helping a private art collection to build a storage for data carriers, which is climate controlled at 15 centigrade Celsius and 35% relative humidity. It's a small room with a suspended rolling rack system that contains all data carriers from film to video. But to be honest, that's only one of a few of its kind so far, and I don't know how many institutions in Europe or US have such dedicated storage spaces like this. When budgets are tight, it might be easier to concentrate on relative humidity, like in this case. Nowadays, we talk about other storage, and this seems to be even more complicated than designing the perfect physical storage. The bigger the institution, the easier it might be to rely on a working IT environment. We heard the opposite today. This means to understand what IT people think and talk about, and to offer them well-structured data and, more important, the needed metadata to deal with the delivered files. But smaller archives or collections often must focus on local solutions due to budget and staffing constraints. The gathering of basic metadata is even harder for these institutions. It would be great help for these smaller institutions if there would be one central digital storage which provides a safe storage system with full redundancy and some basic service and support. Like the Bundesfilmarchiv serves as the central federal deposit for film works, there should be a Bundesdigitalarchiv. This digital archive could serve as a digital repository for institutions which are dealing with time-based media content. And yes, you are right, this probably would not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but it could be a perfect base for other services. I know that some local public services offer storage, but this is often at costs that are beyond the budgets of smaller institutions. Okay, enough dreaming, but the lack of affordable, redundant and safe storage is also a bottleneck for digitization and new acquisitions. In both cases, a whole bunch of questions always arises, and to be honest, still today we are faced with one core question. How can we make sure that the full richness of authenticity of an audiovisual object won't be changed dramatically during digitization? Especially for archives, it was not an easy task to find a compromise between ethical aspects and the needs of an archive. This might be easier for a museum since ethical aspects have more weight. I remember endless discussions regarding perfect file formats, containers, workflows, and capture cards. But even then, it is not an easy task to define the exact specifications for a tender and finding the perfect service provider. Many providers have significantly cut down their services or are bankrupt. We are facing a dying business, and not only the data carriers get old, also do the machines and the people. So it could get harder to find companies, labs and businesses which provide core competencies for the artworks in our custody. Besides these questions, a lot of collections are in the need for condition reporting and supervision of exhibitions. It starts with multi-channel video artworks, but it's very often tied to complex installations. I made the experience that single-channel artworks hardly are on the list when I'm asked for support. Most of the requests come for artworks that are complex because of physical items or from the equipment. While the understanding of a single-channel video artwork is easy in most cases, it gets difficult when more technical components are involved. Condition reports can get quite comprehensive when every aspect of an artwork is tested and described in detail. From my experience, some collections did underestimate the complexity of some artworks in the past. In some cases, I must admit, what a lucky coincidence, because that's why they acquired these artworks. But a lot of institutions learned from obsolescence and breakdown of components in the past years how time-consuming it can be to keep these artworks running and how complex it can get to bring broken artworks back running in the intended way. Luckily, in this case, it was just one transformer that broke, but what when one of the fluorescent tubes breaks? It's a nightmare. Even more expensive and even more complex on the long run are installations which consist of several components and technical devices. In the case of Wang Shui's Weak Pearl, there are computers, audio equipment, LEDs and a lot of transformers involved. The artwork was made in situ by the artist and needed a full documentation after this installation. I noticed that a lot of collections nowadays are very cautious when it comes to such complex installations. They learned from previous acquisitions how painful it can be to preserve these artworks, send them on loan or reinstall them just 5 years later. While it seems easy to preserve the outer walls of an Kusama infinity room because it's a simple construction made of wood, this is definitely not the case for the glowing bubbles. They are fragile and hard to maintain. Their surface is very delicate and susceptible for dents and scratches. Even more attention needs the software which controls the glowing and color-changing effects of the artwork. It is running on a not specified board located in a so-called black box, not to speak from the LED panels inside the bubbles, which are wired through the stainless steel poles. Artworks like these are the reason why my business model changed during the last years almost completely to consultancy. And from my experience, this is one of the biggest demands from private and public collections. There's a strong need for professional assistance through the whole life cycle of an artwork. The long-term preservation starts ideally before the acquisition. A tailored questionnaire where all relevant questions regarding the artwork are covered should be the base for its preservation in the future. In my experience, this important step has not been implemented in the acquisition process of many institutions in Germany. Subjectively, private collections seem to be much more open to this pre-screening than public collections. I can only speculate, but there seems to be a barrier between the curators and conservators. Behind closed doors, I have been told that conservators are often perceived as holding things back. This may be one reason why conservators are often rather not involved in the process before acquisition. The other reason why pre-acquisition checks are not implemented in the workflow is very simple. It is the lack of specialized conservators or other professionals in the collections. With the lack of communication and the lack of professional trained people, a lot of tasks remain unaddressed or just not monitored. Sometimes it's even not clear after signing the purchase contract what exactly will be part of the artwork and which components need to be sourced afterwards. Same is for risk assessment. Some artworks include Some artworks include components which are potentially harmful to people or are very fragile. This must be clarified prior to acquisition to determine if the artwork can be part of a regular exhibition or if precautions are required. Asta Gröting's work A Spark of Passion, where a spark ignites at regular intervals between two wires mounted in a hole in the wall, is only one example for such artworks. But even the communication with the seller is sometimes problematic or complicated. Sometimes the important questions are not asked out of caution or concern for the seller. This also counts for the transport or transfer, where a lot of institutions just trust the seller that there will be everything okay. After the delivery, there's sometimes no check for completeness, condition, or functionality, especially at complex artworks or with files. This leads to the conclusion that multidisciplinary art needs a multidisciplinary approach for conservation and long-term preservation. It needs a collaborative approach between different professions, different professionals, and specialists. In my case, I realized very early that the conservators' view alone will not be enough to get the whole picture when dealing with time-based art or light art. Especially when you start to identify the work-defining properties. The definition of the technical viewpoint may differ from the curatorial viewpoint, but this is needed not only on the personal level when working as a conservator in the field of time-based media. In my experience, these discussions are still too rare in private and public collections in Germany. For me, this led to the decision that the focus of my freelance work had to change. It needs an art historical approach plus the view of a conservator in one entity. That's why art historian Dr. Anna Schäffler and I started in 2019 our company, where we combine the expertise of both fields. The mission of our holistic approach is to provide preservation as a service. One motivation for this is that the questions from the beginning of my presentation and from the beginning of my professional career in this field, all these questions are still important and they are still here. But they have shifted to digital and they are loaded with more complexity. So there seem to be a lot of obstacles when working with time-based media artworks. But if you ask me, if I see a hesitation in buying time-based media art at my clients, so this is only for my clients, I must admit that with one exception, I can't see much hesitation in buying time-based media art. On the one hand, this is sometimes the consequence of the inexperience with the complexity of these artworks. I've often seen works being purchased I would have voted against as a conservator. Self-critically, I must admit that as a result of this, some wonderful works perhaps would not be in one of these collections today. But there are also works that disappeared into storage after the first and only exhibition. Their complexity or cost intensity sealed their fate to stay there and decay slowly in the dark. On the other hand, I see more selection and caution before buying time-based media artworks. Public and private collections seem to evaluate more precisely what consequences, personally and financially, an acquisition might have. They check very careful the post-acquisition costs, storage conditions, technical equipment, and if artists formulate very strict requirements for exhibitions. But when a commitment finally is made, the decision for complex artworks seem even to be stronger. The only exception I was talking about are NFTs so far. Even though we provided some information how to deal with NFTs, none of our clients was excited to acquire their first blockchain artwork. Ironically, some artists started to drop their NFTs to their collectors or provided certificates of authenticity as NFTs. So in the long run, a lot of museums need to face the next generation of digital art. At the end of my presentation, you might argue that you are still waiting for the answer, what could it make more attractive to acquire and display time-based media artworks? Or in other words, what needs to be done to give time-based media artworks a similar presence in collections and a similar life expectancy as works of traditional art? So then let's wrap up the main pain points for time-based media artworks. They are often very complex. They are sometimes very expensive. Failure rates might be higher than with traditional artworks. It's overall time-consuming to work with these artworks. it takes time to install, to discover, to preserve, to maintain, whatever. They need constantly a lot of care, and they are hard to maintain and to preserve. That's a lot on the list, and if we would make a 5 minutes brainstorm in this room today, we would probably find 1,000 and more reasons why time-based media artworks do not have the same presence in collections and exhibitions like traditional artworks. So we can all conclude there is no easy answer, but I was asked to give one, at least from Margit. And well then, my very subjective and very personal answer is very simple and maybe somewhat disappointing. I think the ease of use combined with a good documentation, appropriate spare parts or emulation options would be a great start. Put a federal public storage in, my dream of a Bundesdigitalarchiv, and if artists then would include a maintenance service, I would have much less work as a conservator, but much more free time to experience complex artworks as a visitor. Thank you so much.